Welcome everyone to Rough Point. My name is Gina Tangora. I'm the Director of Engagement here at NRF. I'm part of the executive team along with Alyssa Lozapone, who's our Director of Preservation somewhere back there, and Amy Windsor, there she is. And Amy Windsor, she's our Chief Operating Officer and Chief Financial Officer. Before the folks on the panel introduce themselves, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for joining us for this discussion. We're going to start with a moderated panel discussion and then continue with questions and comments from you all. We're recording this as well, so thank you, Kayla. And this program is going to be available to watch afterwards. And I also want to give a special thank you to the Rhode Island Humanities for the support of this program. RI Humanities is an independent state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities that seeds, supports, and strengthens public history, cultural heritage, civic education, and community engagement by and for all Rhode Islanders. All right, so now I'm just going to ask you all to please introduce yourselves, and then I'll give some background context for this conversation for those of you who are not as familiar with NRF and our work. So, Sunny, can we start with you, please?
Hi, I'm Teresa Guzman Stokes, Executive Director of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society.
Hi, I'm Nikki Williams. I'm Curator of Collections at the Preservation Society of Newport County.
And I'm Keith Stokes. I'm Director of the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the state of Rhode Island.
I'm Wanda Hopkins. I'm representing... Hi, I'm Wanda Hopkins. I'm a member of the Nahaganset tribe, and I'm also a volunteer at Tamaqua Museum.
Hi everyone, I'm Becca Bertrand. I'm the Executive Director of the Newport Historical Society. I'm one of the board chairs of Preserve Rhode Island, and I'm also a tenant of the Newport Restoration Foundation.
Okay, thank you all. So I just have some slides prepared, just a quick overview of the history of NRF and our Telling Stories initiative, which is what sparked this conversation. So for those of you who don't know, NRF was founded by tobacco-heiress, philanthropist, preservationist, and collector Doris Duke in 1968 to preserve and restore the architectural and cultural heritage of Newport. So over the past 6 decades, NRF has acquired, moved, and restored over 100 buildings and spaces on Aquidneck Island. Many are dating to the 18th and early 19th centuries. We have a full-time preservation crew of mill workers, field carpenters, and painters who carry out the cyclical preservation and restoration work on our houses. And then most of the buildings in our portfolio today are lived in by our tenant stewards who help us take care of these historic homes. So each of these houses currently displays signage with the date of the earliest known construction, an NRF logo, a statement that says founded by Doris Duke, and the name of a previous resident of the house. So our Telling Stories Dispersed Monument Initiative is really a formalization of the research, writing, and sharing of projects. We recognize that the houses we take care of have in many cases centuries of history, and generations of Newporters have lived in and worked in these historic houses. We've been thinking about the houses themselves as monuments and a commemoration of the stories of the many people connected to the houses. So that includes those who've been traditionally left out of the historical narrative, or those who may have not been considered quote unquote prominent enough to make it into the story of the house. So part of our efforts have been a design project to share more information through the signs that are on each house and a way to point people in the direction of where they can find out more information. So we're really excited about this conversation today because we're hoping it's going to spark a really good conversation about the ways that we can share more of these stories with the public and you all. And we are also hoping that this is going to help move forward the conversation about protocols and guidelines that is going to be useful for those in the cultural heritage organization community here in Newport and across the country as well. So with that, we're going to get to our first question. Okay, so I'm going to start with Sunny. Our first question is, why are the names of historic houses important? And then we're going to talk about who gets to decide what a house is named. So we'll start with you, Sunny. Why are they important?
I think that any place I visit, buildings that have names on it tells me something about what the community values. It's houses with names usually direct you to a place where a famous person was. It could direct you to the fact that this was built by a famous architect or something of the time period. Having those, though, has, as you're doing now, has to be something that's a conversation, because oftentimes we run into times where houses are named for someone who first lived in the house, but perhaps held no prominence in the community and isn't in fact the resident that the community most values.
Okay, thank you. So Becca, in our earlier conversation, you had mentioned that there are some standards, or the National Park Service notes that names should reflect the quote greatest period of significance. So would you like to respond to that? What does that mean?
Sure. I think in preparation for this conversation, I spent some time talking to historic preservationists around the country and talking to a few state historic preservation officers. And in their response to this question, how do you name a house? The conversation goes back to the national standards, and national standards encourage you to look at what the National Park Service dictates, which sends you to what you're doing for a National Register nomination, which would ask you what was the period of significance for the house and who gave the house its time period of significance or its significance, which could mean a number of different things. And there are standards that say that it could either be the owner or the builder of the house, some significant persons or events associated with the property, an original or a later significant use of the property, like Faneuil Hall is a good example of that, its location, or an innovator or unusual characteristic, like Lucy, the Margate elephant is a really good example of that, or some accepted professional, scientific, technical, or traditional name for something like Jefferson's Monticello. Like, that's a really good example of something. So there's lots of different things that go into naming a house. So I think when you think of just a name on a building, it does carry a lot of weight, but there's different meanings to significance. And so I think that's something that we can unpack. But to just say significant, there's a lot of different definitions to significance. So significant is not just a throwaway word. There's lots of different things that we can address when you say significance. But it's important to remember that there are national standards, and until there is a greater revision to what a national standard is, that is something that, as preservationists, we do need to kind of refer back to that. Although not every one of your properties is on the National Register, it's not independently listed on the National Register, that is something important to consider.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to respond to that before we move on to the next question?
I'd like to respond to the word significant.
Sure.
Significant to whom, into what era, and what is the purpose behind adding significance to a place? So we need to give that some thought. I just wanted to add that.
Oh, yeah. And I think it's different everywhere. It's different for every house, and different for every space, and different for every place around the country. And that's a really important thing to remember, too. For every building technique, for every space, significant means different things. And I think it's flexibly written for that reason, because significant can mean different things to different people, to different cultures, to different places in the country.
All right, so to build on this, no pun intended, what other important considerations should go into the naming of a house beyond the built environment or the architecture or the people who lived in, worked in, and built a house? And how does a sense of place or an importance of a place contribute to the name? So, Wanda, could you start us off with a response to that?
Sure.
Please.
Sure. Could you repeat that question?
It's a very long question. So thinking about, I think when we had our pre-meeting, we talked a little bit about thinking about the place and the land and the people who existed on a place well before the physical structure of the house. So we've just talked about significance related to a previous owner, or a builder of a house, or maybe the architect. So is there a way that there are other considerations that we should be thinking of when we talk about naming a house?
Yes, I think we should consider the idea of place and what that means to the indigenous people. When you talk about Aquidneck Island, right, the spelling of Aquidneck Island, depending on the resources that you look at, even the spelling of Aquidneck Island might be different, although you're talking about the same place. Narragansett people, when we named a place, we called it we called it something that had to do with what we were doing there. And place had a lot to do with ourselves as our identity. So even our names that were given, you would be given a name that included the place in which you resided. And so some of that knowledge is not captured, obviously, in some of the historical records, but it is part of our oral history. And so when we're talking about place and erasure, as we'll continue to talk about, and whose voices get to be heard and what is significant, for the Nahaganta people, the significance of place goes beyond just naming it, but also the people who reside there, not just today, but in the past, and those who will be residing there in the future.
Thank you. Keith, would you like to add your thoughts to that?
Thank you. My general sense is I think people of color have been waiting 400 years for that question and for this opportunity. Speaking candidly, homes, places are named largely from either a colonizer class or a owner class. And to this very day in 2024, most of the names on those prominent historic properties in this city, in this state, in this country, across the world, still reflect largely colonizers, winners of war, majority winners of war, and certainly enslavers. And I think what's significantly frustrating is, particularly in a place such as Newport, that has so many historic structures. In fact, we have one of the largest existing extant structures of pre-American Revolution buildings. Many of those buildings were where indigenous people, African heritage people lived, worked, and worshiped well before the American Revolution, certainly after, but it's completely been erased because, again, we're not part of the dominant narrative. So I think what's excitingly important about what you're doing here, and as someone who's worked with historic organizations across the diaspora and certainly the country, this is the first time that I've been participating with this type of question in this type of environment. I wish more people of color were here tonight because they need to hear this and be a part of this. But I think the first incredibly important step is we need to recognize the erasure, how much has been lost, how much primary evidence has been lost as a part of the recording and interpreting and eventually the naming of the history that we feel we most value.
All right. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next question unless somebody would like to continue that.
I can just add
Sure.
another thing. And some of that historical erasure was done intentionally, right? So that some of the buildings that are constructed here in Aquidneck Island, they purposely were constructed over historical burial sites, historical habitation. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. All right, so our next question is, what's the community's role in naming houses? And has the community traditionally had a role, or what voices are and aren't included in this discussion? So, Nikki, how would you respond to that? I know that you researched, wrote about, and spoke with other scholars who study the Chinese immigrant experience, and I'm guessing that not many people are aware of the long and rich history of Chinese Americans in Newport. So, how stable or unstable is the official narrative about a house in the daily lives of the people who live and work alongside these houses, would you say?
Well, just to, as Keith said, the communities that have traditionally named houses have been fairly exclusive, and they've tended to represent, in the case of Newport, a moneyed aristocracy, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant aristocracy. So the extent of the community's involvement. To the extent that communities have been involved, they have tended to be narrowly defined communities. My work for an exhibition last year really got me thinking about these issues. Last year I curated an exhibit for the Preservation Society called The Celestial City, Newport and China. And a large part of my research focused on trying to learn more about the historic Chinese and Chinese American community of Newport, We didn't know this until very recently because simply, you know, the evidence had been ignored or willfully erased. But Newport supported a very large Chinese American community during the Gilded Age. There were at least 60 businesses that opened here and operated here between about 1870 and 1915. Gina, put up yeah. This is a wonderful example. So this is a photograph of the Mika Spencer house that I found in the collection of the Library of Congress. Mika Spencer was a merchant in the 18th century, a merchant and perhaps a privateer. Not much is known about him. But when I was looking for photographs of this building because I had found in city directories from the late 19th century and early 20th century that this building had been time and again the location of Chinese laundries, Chinese-owned laundries in Newport. I found at least 4 Chinese business owners who operated laundries at this location. And when I went looking for images of the address, 85 to 87 Thames Street, I found time and again the building had been cataloged as the Mika Spencer House. And even when there was evidence of Chinese ownership of a business on that property, such as, maybe if you go back a few photographs, Gina, to the first one. There's evidence here of a Chinese presence in Newport. If you look on the far right, you can see the words laundry written across the window on the far right. That's the Ling Li Laundry, opened in 1900. And if you go forwards, Gina, so these are photographs of the interior of the house. If you could go a little further, 1897 to 1903. Sing Li Laundry is at that same location. If you go forwards again, Charles Lai had a laundry there, 1904 to 1916. And again, when I went looking for these businesses, these names, I only ever encountered Mika Spencer House. This photograph is actually by Maud Lyman Stevens, who was a Newport historian associated, an officer with the Newport Historical Society, and she wrote a book that you may know, Gina, about Vernon House, which I think is a property that you've been thinking a lot about recently.
Yeah, she wrote the first official history of Vernon House in 1913. Yeah. Okay.
Could you go back to the photograph of the older man? Yeah, and trying to think about how do you recover these histories that are written out of the official house name. To your question about community, can you involve community in this work? I thought it would be important to try to contact descendants, and so I was really lucky to be able to identify and reach out to the grandson of a Chinese laundryman who operated his business in this location. The man's name was Gum Lee, and his grandson was Terrence Lee. And Terrence Lee really generously shared his family's story with us and gave this building all these new meanings and resonances, and personalized the building. That in these photographs, the photographs are there to record historic art and architecture of Newport. They're not there to tell personal stories or certainly the stories of the Chinese immigrant community. So we wanted to use those photographs to another end, which was to illustrate the Lee family story from their perspective. And I think when you do that, when you learn to look at images like that anew or aslant, askew, then you see so much more.
And Sunny, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything about the role of the community in this conversation.
Nikki mentioned something very important in that she said it was a very niche community that, was making those decisions. That's not to say that places do not have names within other communities, even if they're not widely known that way. I'll use an as example, the Common Burying Ground in Newport. There's a whole section there that in the community was called Godzilla Laker. And yet, if you asked, if you went to City Hall and asked for Godzilla Laker, they didn't know where it was. That's because within the Black community, it had been known that way for generations. It had been called that. Of course, now there's a sign. But that's a case where someone has decided on a name without asking the community that it pertains to, if that's the name that they call it by, or if that's what they want. Another example is 47 John Street, which, my, a wonderful mentor, Mrs. Eleanor Keyes, who really was kind of the Black historian in Newport when I first arrived in Newport. And she used to always say, that's the Van Horn house. That's the Van Horn house. And it wasn't until I actually went there and noticed that, no, that's not the name on the house. But for years, that's what we all called it. So I think it's really important that when you talk about, having a community participation, that you're actually going out and finding those members of the various communities who have involvement in it.
Okay, thank you both. All right, sorry, we're gonna fast forward. Okay. So before we get to the next question, I wanted to share more about one of the houses that we steward, the house at 42 Division Street, which is otherwise known as the George Buckmaster House. It may have been built around 1748, although the original house may also have been older than that. Here's a little bit of background on the house. The original structure, size, and floor plan of 42 Division is currently not known. John Jepson was a captain of slave ships who trafficked over 700 African heritage men, women, and children. He sold the house and land to Captain George Buckmaster in 1748. It is likely that Buckmaster, who also profited directly from the trade of enslaved people, enlarged the house along the south and to the rear of the building, following his practice of investing his profits from the slave trade in real estate ventures. In the late 18th century, the building was the parsonage for the first Congregational Church, but by the turn of the 20th century, the home had a history of African heritage ownership. It was the home of several generations of African heritage families, and when the Berry family moved to Division Street by 1914, they were joining an already well-established Black community. The Union Congregation Church was just a few doors down, and this church had evolved out of the African Union Society organization, which was founded in 1780. So the Berry's home was also briefly a tourist home for Black travelers in the late 1930s and was in the 1939 edition of the Green Book. So that's just a little bit of background information about 42 Division Street. So the question is, why would a name be changed, and why would a name not be changed, and what might the process of naming or changing a name look like? So Keith, would you like to start response to that?
Again, I've been waiting a long time for this. Division Street, which is the center of the historic hill, has been historically an African heritage community dating back to the 18th century, well into the 20th century. There are 3 historic Black churches in that immediate area. There might be Airbnbs today, unfortunately, but I think what's most important is that there's an opportunity here to finally, factually, and historically accurately represent the history of Newport and the communities in these homes by the majority of people who once lived, worked, and worshiped there. And I would suggest if we're going to either include names or change names or make recommendations for recognition, I see it less as naming but more recognition. Let's start to recognize not only the people who have been marginalized and underutilized, but more importantly, the people, men, women, and children and families who've been significant contributors to those communities, to those homes within Newport. And if we were to do it based upon that criteria, based on influence and impact and historic longevity, it's not going to look like George and Martha Washington. It's going to be indigenous people, it's going to be Jewish people, it's going to be people of color, who very much represented the heart and soul of these homes and these neighborhoods for centuries, not decades, but for centuries, which today is largely unknown. So again, I compliment the Honor for doing this, because I've never ever seen an organization, institution take this type of effort, and hopefully this is going to catch on.
Thank you. Becca, would you like to respond to that as well, please?
Sure. I think in a lot of ways what you're talking about is interpretive signage, even more than just the name that's on a building. And I think that instead of looking at a choice that you make in 2024 or 2025, if you were to in one way incorporate something that makes a sign a living, breathing document, so that it's something that links to your website, and I think you're going to talk about this a little later on, but if you put something so that you can have a QR code so you can learn more about this house, because really when you walk by a house, You see a sign, that's an opportunity for us as, public historians, people who work in this field. It's an opportunity to learn more. It's a door to go in and learn more about the house. And, I want to know about this. I want to learn more about this architectural style, or I want to know more about that person who lived here. And it also gives you the opportunity so that history didn't stop at this moment. Maybe in our house, maybe I'm going to give birth to a child who becomes a president of the United States. And maybe she is going to be this incredible person who is going to change the world one day. And then there's an opportunity where the next person who lives in the house has something wonderful. And so we don't say that this is the only thing that ever happened here because something else happens in this house and then your house keeps having layers and layers and layers of history happening to it. And that's why we love old houses, because history keeps on going. It doesn't stop in one day in time. And I think if you make your signs be an opportunity to keep having more and more stories layer on top of it, the cake keeps growing and growing and growing. And that's why we love this community and why we love living here, because there is so much history. So I think if what you're talking about is more than a name, it's a sign, and it's a way to just keep growing your history. That's one way for you to add more opportunities for growth, I think.
Okay.
There's also the challenge, though, of information overload. A lot, particularly on a sign, there's the challenge of distilling.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. Yes. Yeah, lots of interesting design challenges, too. It's not just the information you're sharing, but how you're sharing it, definitely. Okay. All right. So now we are going to talk a little bit about the question of should houses be named after people, after one person. I think this is continuing what Becca was saying. The example I have on the screen here is another house in our collection, 29 Toro Street. It's otherwise known as the Bulliard Perry House. That's actually technically two names. Again, a really brief overview of some of the former residents. Early in the house's history, it was the home of Jewish merchant and slave trader Moses Satius, who ran the newly established Bank of Rhode Island on the first floor. The building was the home for prominent Newporters, including Captain Oliver Hazard Perry, until the mid-19th century, and then it was used primarily for commercial space. Between the years 1901 and 1908, the Allen brothers, who were black entrepreneurs, owned the building and opened the Toro dining room. There was a separate private dining room for ladies. And then the Salvation Army used the building as its headquarters beginning in 1914 before it was acquired by NRF in around 1973. So, to that question, should houses be named after people or one person? And then who would or what is left out if we pick one name? Sonny, could you respond? You want to? Okay, go ahead.
Because I lived this growing up in Newport.
Yeah.
My Jewish grandmother, that was the Moses Satius house.
Yeah.
And my African heritage grandfather was a J.T. Hallen restaurant in black business, because that's what they identified with, and that's how they saw it. And I grew up knowing both things. But unfortunately, I was in that rare circumstance where I knew both things, and most other, if not all other students in growing up in Newport didn't know anything about Moses Satius or anything about J.T. or D.B. Allen. That was invisible to them. They probably remember the Salvation Army being there in the 60s. So I think it's exceedingly important that we do include the names of the people. I mean, that's what brings history to life, is the people who live there, work there, worship there. And I think that's an easy identifier for people today and going forward.
Okay, thank you. Sonny, would you like to add something to that?
I'm a little divided on it. I absolutely think if you had a president that lived there, and I'll put a plug in for Van Horn, of course, the first black man to be in the state legislature. Those kinds of important marks, whether it's somebody rising to attain a lofty office or whatever, you would see why that would bring interest to the house and why you'd want that name on there. On the other hand, to Becca and Keith's point, every home has multiple layers, or I should say every site, because they're not all homes, has multiple layers of history, and sometimes they're very compelling. Every layer is compelling. And so what do you do in that case? And I think that, now in the digital age, there is no reason why we can't create QR codes or something that gives the layers of history. But then again, going back to my first point, is that there are those rare homes that there is one significant person or one significant event that it represents, or perhaps is the opportunity to highlight achievement in areas that weren't seen before.
Interesting. Wanda, would you like to respond to this question too? We talked a little bit about the idea of erasure, in that perhaps if a house is named or a building is named after one person, that it might contribute to the erasure of its complete history.
Yeah, so I think about that word we're using again, significance, and the erasure of what the place means to people who no longer maybe are allowed to even to visit those places. I'm thinking 2 weekends ago, I was able to go to Little Compton, and one of our tribal members, they reconstructed a machine, and they put it in the water, and paddled, and so if anybody gets a chance to visit and look at that, it's a wonderful experience. But those waters and those lands, they were inaccessible to us until that project. And I think about, when we're thinking about land and structures and presence, I think about structures that are, I mentioned already, constructed to conceal. The Great Friends Meeting House, for instance, it's documented that underneath that structure, thank you, someone's nodding, they know what I'm talking about, that helps me out a lot. There are artifacts there that date back, 3000 BCE. So those are stories that are buried, but are so important, I think, if we're going to talk about place and we're going to talk about historical significance. We have to remember to include things that maybe are not so well known, but are documented and can be verified.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move on to the next question. Sorry, we talked about that. Okay, so is a requirement like length of time residing in or working in the house useful as an indicator of significance? Because we keep coming back to this question of what is significant? What does the word significant mean? So, Nikki, how would you answer this question?
I think it can be, but I certainly don't think it's the only criteria. We own and operate as one of our house museums the Isaac Bell House on Bellevue Avenue, named after cotton merchant Isaac Bell, who lived there with his wife Jeanette Gordon Bell. He only lived there less than 6 years before he passed away, and then the house was sold to the Barger family, who were there more than 60 years. There's really currently no mention of the Bargers on our house tour, which is something we've been thinking about. Is the Barger residence significant enough that we should incorporate it into our tours and our programming? Is an open question. Currently, the period of significance of the house is the 1880s. It's a McKim and White property. So Isaac Bell commissioned the house. So that's our justification for its naming, is that we view it as an architectural masterpiece. But again, there's so many stories over such a long period that get lost in that designation.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else like to respond to this question before we move on to signs? Okay. All right, so this is our last formal question section. And this is something that we've been thinking a lot about lately as we're working through our own design template for signage. So what are the design challenges in sharing information about the history of a house and the people connected to the house through a sign? So how might a template be useful, or how might it perpetuate erasure? So Wanda, I know you had some thoughts on our initial design template. So what we're showing on screen are just some design ideas. This is not anything that has been finalized.
Yeah, so when I first saw this, I thought, okay, so I don't know if you have the picture of the sign on the house. I don't know if you,
Yeah, I'll go back.
yeah, so what I thought was, is it visible from the street when you're standing there? And QR codes, you know, how significant are they going to be even 20 years from now, right? So my thought was, okay, are we just checking a box? Are we saying, okay, we're going to include indigenous voice from my perspective. We're going to include historical knowledge that wasn't there previously. We're going to add a line onto this sign. And to me, that it's almost like checking a box. It's like, I've done a lot of community-facing activities, events, programs, you name it, and I really am cautious about checking a box, saying, okay, we've done that. We've put the names up there, so therefore that alleviates the importance of inclusion here. So that was my thought, is if you're going to truly add significant historical knowledge to a site, you want to make sure that it has some significance. It's not just an unreadable line or part of the QR code that might become insignificant in a few years.
So that sounds like a yes and. Like you wouldn't just stop with including more information on the sign or wait to get more information, that's just sort of a starting point to the conversation.
Yes, I work at URI, and so we have lots of different ways to commemorate contributors or students or people of significance. So there's a lot of ideas. We haven't discussed that yet, so I don't want to give a whole list. But there are other ways to show or to include historical knowledge at a site.
Thank you. Becca?
I think if you think of this in the land of, donor signage, you're always putting the most important donor with the biggest text, and then you're going down in size. And so you're saying here that the most important thing is the address, but the address is already on the building.
Some cases, not all cases.
So I wonder if maybe that's wasted space, and you have limited retail here, so maybe you're kind of, you could, if you want to be prioritizing names or the use of the house, you could be renegotiating some things. But I think, I'm a huge proponent for having a QR code because I think that's what makes it a breathing document.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I just wanted to add to Wanda's comment about just checking a box. I think that the important thing that we need to see is that right now we're talking about names of houses, but it can't be the final and end goal. That there has to be continued work, whether it's through programming or, adding to the website or whatever, but it has to go on so that we're telling the full story rather than, as Wanda said, just checking a box.
There also, there's so many, casual walkers about the city who aren't going to go to the website. So also, how do you inject it? How do you inject these messages into their bloodstream? How do you capture? How do you atmospherically transform the city, if that is the goal, for more casual passersby who aren't necessarily going to perform that level of engagement?
Pull out their phone and scan a QR code. Yeah, I think it's a real challenge, is including information so that people have something to start with, and then how to learn more, I think, is important too. Yeah.
No, I would just say, I've been through 35 years of signage issues within the city. And to me, it's a design challenge. I'm more interested in who makes the determination of what goes where and how it reads. And my greatest concern is that I don't think the institutions that are making these decisions, public and private, be it a historical institution or a public institution, is truly representative of the people who have not participated, but on the outside looking in for centuries. And I think the most important next step is, how do we recruit and how do we empower a diverse group of men, women, and families and people to participate in those decision-making processes? That's the most important step, because again, having one or two people or having a few of us up here as tokens, it's not enough. I'm old, I've been around forever. There are younger people of color that are much more dynamic and have much more creative, innovative ideas that should be at the table, and not just for myself, singularly. So I think the most incredibly important next step is, how do we broaden this discussion? How do we get and ensure that people are actively participating with different voices and different view sets in this discussion? And it also has to be anchored on indigenous people, African heritage people, and other people of color who have been the backbone of this community and country.
Gina, there's another thing I wanted to add just really quickly that we didn't talk about really at all on this panel, and that is what I think is really lovely on the sign, is that you added the date of the restoration of the building, because that is key to your mission. And I think it's important to acknowledge the work crews that do the work on these houses and the restoration work that Doris Duke did to bring these houses to life and save them. And I think that's a really nice thing that's on the signs.
Potentially on the sign, but yes.
On the sign mock-up.
On the sign mock-up. Yes, so the idea is that it's looking at all those different layers of the house, and a really important layer of the house is, well, maybe we'll call it the NRF restoration, because we know our work is continual too as well. So that's the initial restoration, and continues to this day. So yeah, I think we know that the stories we're trying to tell reflect not only the people who lived and worked in the house, but the people who built the house, the people who continue to work on the house, and the people who live in the house today and into the future as well.